Approximately 4 Americans per 100,000 lose their lives in homicide incidents in the United States. That roughly translates to about 12 to 15,000 homicide victims each year, depending on the small swing of the multiplier. Over the past 20 years, the homicide rate in the United States has fallen sharply by 49%. While that figure does look to be something to celebrate for, it unfortunately doesn't account for the least publicized crime perpetrated against the American public. 900,000 per year, keep that number in mind. In the 80s, roughly 150,000 people were reported missing per year. Fast forward 36 years, bring back the aforementioned figure, you're looking at a difference of 750,000 missing persons per year. Even when you account for the population growth, the increase in missing persons reports is disproportional, without any exaggeration. U.S. population in 1980 was 226 million. Today we have 320 million individuals living in this nation. One does not need to be a math genius to figure out the non-symmetrical growth of population versus missing persons reports per year. But of course those figures don't tell the whole story. If this country lost nearly 1 million of its citizens each year, America would go extinct in no time. When you look at the number closely, you'll find that about 96% of these cases were coded as runaway. A little less than 1% as abducted by non-custodial parents, and then there are the rest. So we can narrow it down to about 2 to 3% of the missing persons cases that deserve a closer look. It's roughly about 15 to 20,000 cases per year. But what I truly want to speak of are the 1% of the cases, or roughly 5 to 10,000 cases per year, that get swept under the rug. The official number disclosed by the government for unresolved cases average at about 2,000 missing persons reports per year. Most missing persons are located or returned home. I believe the government classifies about 99% of missing persons reports being resolved each year. But you have to consider the fact that a small percentage of that 99% include people found deceased. It doesn't matter that the killer is caught or at large, because as long as the body is found, the case is officially resolved. In my personal opinion, whether the missing persons are found dead or alive, about 3% of total missing persons reports involve something a lot more sinister than the media or the government would like you to believe. But I can't speak up something as serious on assumptions only. So I'll go back to my original figure of 1% and tell you what I personally believe is happening. So first off, you may want to know what makes me qualified to speak of this topic. The answer, I suppose, is simple. I worked as a homicide detective for the past 20 years. I've seen way too many disturbing things over the years, but the ones that always bothered me were the cases where the missing persons returned, but not in the same state as they had left. Their changed mental state were always attributed to drugs and trauma. While they do apply in certain cases, they're not representative of all returnees. I'll speak of two separate cases in this story. The first one is a case in which the missing person returned, but let me make it clear that this wasn't my case. This case belongs in the 3% of missing persons reports, of which I stress the sinister connection. The second case was my own. Unfortunately, on this one, the missing person was found deceased, and hence the reason why I was assigned to it. This case belongs in the 1% of the cases that are stranger than fiction. Alright, let's talk about the first case. A 15-year-old white female from an upper middle class neighborhood went missing in early 2000s. I won't name the state or the city to ensure the young woman's privacy, but I will give her an alias for the sake of storytelling. Let's call her Jane. Jane was an honor student, had many friends, was in a happy relationship with a boyfriend for a year. She was fairly popular in school because she was a looker, had no records in or outside of the school, and came from a fine family. There was nothing about Jane which suggested her to be a likely candidate to run away from her home, but the FBI closed the case as such, much to the protest of the detective originally assigned to the case. Let's also give an alias for the detective. We'll call him Detective Mills. The FBI wasn't involved initially, but they took over the case once Jane was found out of state. The crossing of the state gave them legal jurisdiction over the case, but the FBI getting involved in small cases like Jane's, and especially one with the missing person found, is unheard of. The FBI are short in manpower under normal operation, so they never actively try to get involved in cases that are already being investigated. Also, it's rare that the FBI would claim jurisdiction over such low-profile cases. Most of the times, if they get involved, it's because the local police have requested assistance in profiling. Hence, the point is, it's rare. Locals don't want the FBI getting involved, and that's been the norm ever since the Bureau was founded. So, going back to Jane, she came back a vegetable. Let me explain. So she was seemingly awake during the day, had her eyes open, and ate if you fed her, but didn't comprehend anything and was non-responsive to external stimuli. She didn't chew food, and therefore her parents had to blend everything and feed her using a spoon. The only time you will see a hint of reaction is when you play the music. She often moved her fingers ever so slightly, but she did. Other than that, she slept at nights and pooped in one of those adult diapers. That about describes how she is even till this day. I think Jane was supposed to die. She was found in a warehouse, naked with needle and strap marks all over her body. Some kids wandered into an abandoned warehouse, and they apparently saw her being experimented on. Several men and women in white lab coats were doing all kinds of shits on her, and they actually saw the kids snooping into their activities. Fortunately, the kids ran, and once they were out on the street, where other adults were present, the sickos had to stop the chase. For whatever reason, they left Jane in the warehouse and took off before the cops arrived at the scene. If it wasn't for the children's quick thinking, I don't think Jane would have ever been found. Detective Mills worked on the case together with the local police of the town where Jane was found. They were looking into the abduction case of Jane, the keyword here being abduction. But when the FBI jumped in, took over the jurisdiction, that's when the case took to a new level of strangeness. The Bureau steered the case toward the dime a dozen runaway case. The men and women in the white lab coats were changed into other runaway teens. The strap marks, which clearly showed she was being held against her will, was reported as injuries incurred during several drug-induced sexual orgies. Then to conclude the story, they said the needle marks were the result of self-injection of heroin and crack cocaine. Detective Mills protested how the case was handled, but you might as well scream at a wall when you're dealing with the Bureau. Then it was about 6 months after the FBI closed the case, Mills called me up and told me he had uncovered a key evidence in Jane's abduction case. The only thing he told me over the phone was that the people behind the abduction were some of the most influential individuals in the US. We were supposed to meet up at a diner at 7 p.m. that evening, but Mills didn't show up. I called him half an hour later at 7:30, but instead of Mills, I heard another police officer answer the phone, informing me that Mills had died from a cardiac arrest. I won't dribble on with all the details for why his untimely death was suspicious, but there are two things that I can tell you with absolute certainty. Mills was in top physical form at the time of his death, and he has no family history of heart problems. People like that don't drop dead randomly from cardiac arrest. Mills was killed, I'm sure of it. It mattered a little what I thought though, because life went on without Mills, and it didn't take long for Jane to be forgotten into history books as well. 2 years later, I was assigned to a homicide case involving multiple abductions, torture, and murder. I went to the scene, which was located in the middle of a forest. The land belongs to a private owner, and he just happens to be a very prominent name in politics. I can't reveal his name because of the obvious legal ramification, but also because I fear for my life. In any event, the landowner claimed that he had zero knowledge of an underground bunker existing on his property. His defense was that he couldn't possibly know of all the happenings in the hundreds of acres in his land. A reasonable argument, but it was one that was unnecessary. I say that because he was never the suspect to begin with. We received calls from the governor, mayor, and even the bureau chiming in that we should concentrate our investigative efforts on the actual suspects and not on the highly respected member of our great city. The investigation was rigged from the start. They blinded us, gagged us, and tied our hands, then basically told us to traverse through a maze. I've been doing this job for a long time. When the people in power who have no direct knowledge or relation to a crime start butting in your investigation, it means that the case is destined to go nowhere. So I knew from the start that we wouldn't officially make any progress, let alone arrests in the case. But nonetheless, I did investigate the case as much as I could with the little leash I was given. I'll describe the crime scene for you from this point on. The entrance to the bunker was easy to disguise because the only thing visible from the outside was the large hatch on the ground that led to the interior of the bunker. The hatch was covered with a brown tarp. On top of that was a thin layer of dirt, and finally the leaves on the ground acted as a natural camouflage. Leading to the interior was a steep stair instead of a ladder. I assumed the use of stair was to facilitate carrying the bodies in and out of the bunker. It was quite spacious inside. Several pillars were used in the build to make a large room possible underground. There were 6 cells in total. They were carved into the wall of the room, and the walls themselves were fortified with solid metal panels. We found all kinds of surgical instruments down there. There were also several medical equipment which were used to keep the victims alive as they were experimented on. By about now, you might expect me to say that there were blood and body parts everywhere, but in fact, the bunker was exceptionally clean. This wasn't some type of torture chamber built by a serial killer with little to no medical knowledge. No, this facility was built professionally, and it was maintained with the sanitary level of a clean room you might find at hospitals and labs. We found 2 bodies in there. One of them lay dead in the cell and the other was still on the operating table. The cause of death for the victim in the cell was determined to be exsanguination. In other words, he bled out. The victim on the operating table, we didn't need a coroner to figure out the cause of death because she was barely maintaining her human form. She was missing both of her eyeballs, her skull was drilled in several places, and some type of electrodes were stuck in there. Her arms and legs were skinned surgically and cleanly. I don't know how to explain this medically, but she was missing her anus and rectum. Whoever did it, they bored through her anus, once again surgically and cleanly, and took out the chunk of meat that basically was her anus and rectum. Finally, she was drained of all the blood in her body, and we never found out why those horrible things were done to her. The only other connection we could make was that the case was somehow inspired by satanic beliefs. There were a shit ton of literature on Satan himself, Satan rituals, and then some books about modifying the human body to God knows for what purpose. The books, notes, and even the bodies were taken for analysis, but we never got the reports for them. The higher-ups made it seem like we had jurisdiction over the case, but behind the scene they were busy getting rid of all the evidence pertaining to the case. 2 weeks later, we were taken off the case. We were under gag order as far as that particular case was concerned. Then I woke up one day and it was like we never even sold a bunker. Point taken, I didn't fight it because I knew what would happen to me if I tried to dig deeper into the case, and we just moved on with our lives. In my 20 years as a homicide detective, I came across exactly 3 other cases as bizarre as this, and every single time our investigation were impeded, we were silenced and their cases disappeared into some perpetual pit to never be spoken of again. I've tried talking about this topic with other detectives, but not a single one of them wanted any part of it. It's something that we know that's happening to thousands of people every year, but we also fear for our lives, and so we opt to ignore them. You know how conspiracy theorists talk about the elites getting involved in satanic rituals and whatnot? I don't think that's a theory. I don't know why they do it and what they get out of it, but the bottom line is they are doing it. We can't protect you from them, and that's a fact. Just be careful. Don't place yourself in locations where you're vulnerable. Be mindful of the companies you keep, and when your gut tells you something isn't right, listen to it. After all, it's better to be seen as a weirdo than to end up like Jane. Be safe, everyone. Best of luck to you all. For as long as I can remember, I've always lived in the city. Dealing with upstairs apartment residents walking loudly in the middle of the night or arguing with the next door residents for playing the music too loudly at midnight is something that unfortunately I've become too accustomed to over the years. So imagine how I must have felt when I bought my first house in the suburb. I was elated and felt like everything from that point on would be wonderful. I moved in right after closing on the house, and it was so liberating. 3 bedrooms, 1 study, 2.5 bathrooms. One of them, by the way, is bigger than the kitchen in my old apartment. Front and backyard, I had all that space to myself. 2 days after moving in, I had already said hello to several neighbors and was still in the process of settling in. The doorbell rings, I ask who it is, and the person outside says he's a neighbor. My guard was down because everyone in the neighborhood was so nice, and I just opened the door with a big smile on my face. Luckily, it was some middle-aged dude standing outside with a big smile on his face as well. He introduced himself as Eli and said he lived down the block at the corner house across the street from my home. We shook hands, said some pleasantries, and that was that. I didn't see him again for like about a week, until I was jogging one day and Eli surprised me when he ran up from behind and loudly said hi. I stopped and flailed my arms a little because I was startled. Eli apologized, said he was out on a jog as well. We spoke about some random things, then he ran up saying that he needed to run a little more. He scared the crap out of me, but he seemed like a really chill dude. It was nice to see others jogging in the morning as well, because I just wasn't accustomed to running in empty streets. Then I think it was almost a month after I moved in when Eli swung by my house again. He had a pie in his hand and told me his wife had baked it for me. I was putting together a small coffee table not too far from the entrance, and I guess Eli saw that because he offered to help. He said, I'm really good at putting together IKEA furniture thanks to my wife. I could give you a hand with that if you like. I'll put it together for you in less than 10 minutes. I felt uncomfortable right away. The fact that a man whom I barely know was essentially asking me to let him into my house was kind of ew. It's not like I felt that it was dangerous, but rather slimy for trying to probe me with kind gestures to see if I'd be happy being a side bitch. I put on an equally fake smile and said, "No thank you." I was telling him I actually gotta go out to take care of a few chores, and slowly closed the door so I wouldn't offend him when he took a step forward as if to enter. My heart began racing, and I was about to run toward the back door when my next door neighbor half shouted, "Hi, Leah," and that's when Eli ran off like he had been caught stealing something. I ran straight to Nora, the neighbor who just saved my life without even knowing, and told her what just happened. She brought me into her house, we called the cops, and when they arrived, we all went to the house where supposedly Eli lived. We rang the bell, a man came out to greet us, but it wasn't Eli. He never lived there, and he wasn't even a neighbor. It took only a week for the police to find them, because the only place close enough to find a public parking area was the local Wawa, and they have surveillance cameras installed in and out of the store. As it turns out, he's a sex offender with multiple offenses under his dirty belt, and he knew the area well because he somehow got a job as a landscaper around my town. I was going to be his next victim. I felt so safe in my new house, located in one of the safest areas in my city, and that resulted in me behaving so naively. The experience had put a short-lasting damper in my overall happiness for the new town, but I got over it soon after. Well, sort of, because I got myself a pit bull from the shelter not long after that. It's been 4 years since the incident, and for every year that I lived in this town, Nora always got huge presents from me on her birthdays and on Christmas. She deserves them, and she'll continue getting more of them for as long as I live in this town. That is the end of this video, ladies and gentlemen. I will no longer be commenting on the stories themselves going forward, and so allow me to give a quick thank you to Mr. John Doe and Leah for their stories. I've very much enjoyed the read. Thank you again. Alright, I've got some news for you before I let you go. I don't know if you can tell, you probably couldn't tell unless you're very attentive on the details, but on the last few videos I've been trying different methods of recording the narrations, and I didn't like any of them. The reason for that is because some of the microphones are just better suited for different types of voices, and my current mic does not go well with mine. I've upgraded my mic just a few months ago. In fact, I think I paid like $400 for that. But the price isn't everything. I mean, when it comes to microphones, price matters because it directly translates to quality. But again, it's all about the voice type and the mic itself. So I've made a huge investment over the holidays and got myself a $1,200 microphone. Actually, the mic itself is $700, but the audio interfaces that are necessary to power it and connect it to the PC was an additional $500. I've used it before at my buddy's studio, and the sound quality is simply amazing. The sound it records is on the warmer end, which I like because it suits my voice better, and you'll probably notice the difference as soon as I begin using it, even if you're not an audiophile. The mic was essentially a gift for myself for Christmas, but if you think about it, by proxy it's kind of a gift for you guys as well, because good audio quality is good for you guys as well. At least that's what I told myself when I had to fork up $1,200 for a freaking microphone. All the parts for the new audio setup should arrive by next week, so let's hope it'll be worth the investment. Alright folks, thanks for listening. I'll see you on the next video. Goodbye.